Seda. Hello everyone. I'm Geraldene Wharton. I'm a professor of physical geography here at Queen Mary University of London, and my research and teaching interests are in rivers and estuaries. And when I was invited to give this taster session today, I thought I would take a topic that was central to your A-level. So I know all of you study the water and carbon cycles, and I call them Earth's life support systems because they are the most important cycles on Earth and fundamental to the way we are able to survive on the planet and other biota and all the functioning that goes on planet Earth, or planet water, we should call it really, because it's predominantly a water surface planet. So I'm going to talk about these two cycles, but also give a little bit of wider perspective in relation to things like climate change. And we hear a lot about the climate crisis. In the news at the moment of the tornadoes in America, we hear constantly about floods and floods breaking previous records, wildfires occurring in other parts of the world, melting polar ice caps and sheets, but also drought conditions and desertification. So, and this has been part of the move to try to limit global warming to what's called the Paris Agreement of the 1.5% warming, to keep our temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees C, ideally, and to try to address this climate emergency. We need to act now. So we know that 2010 and onwards, there have been dramatic rises. There have been increases since the Industrial Revolution, but it's hotting up. And from 2020, we have records showing that the climate was over 1 degree C warmer than the baseline that we use, NASA's baseline, back from 1951 to 1980. And this was at the heart of this Paris Agreement, that if we want to keep things from significantly worsening, we have to restrict warming to less than 1.5 degrees C. And this was the main goal of COP26, which some of you may have followed, the Glasgow COP. We've got another one coming up very soon in Dubai. And it was the unofficial strapline of COP26 was keep 1.5 alive. We really have to work very hard to try to keep within this warming limit. And so to have any hope of achieving this, countries must commit to reducing world fossil fuel emissions to net zero by 2050. So there was a very important document published just under 2 weeks ago. It was the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the so-called IPCC report. And it's now accepted that human activities, principally through the emission of greenhouse gases, have caused unequivocal global warming and temperatures reaching above that 1 degree C ceiling. So I've put the links here to the reports, and there's also really interesting commentary from the BBC environment correspondent there with the links. And we can see here that there's an image of someone in the Maldives, and the countries like the Maldives are particularly susceptible to sea level rises. So they are countries that haven't emitted the greenhouse gases, but are now suffering disproportionately from climate change and sea level rise. So we've got that context of climate change and the climate crisis and all these impacts on human beings. And we know that the water and carbon cycles and the links between them are the foundation from which we can understand these contemporary issues. So what you're studying in your A-levels, understanding how water and carbon moves around the earth, that gives the basis for understanding climate change and for then managing our resources sustainably and trying to mitigate hazards such as flooding. So I want to first look at the water cycle and think of it at two major scales, the global scale and the catchment scale. So we'll look first at the global hydrological cycle, then move down to the catchment, and we'll be thinking about the water cycle in terms of a mass balance or a budget approach, where we can begin to put numbers on how much water is moving around the earth and within catchments. And then we'll briefly look at impacts on what human impacts on the water cycle. And I'll introduce you to some concepts. One of them I think you may not have come across before, but it's very interesting, called virtual water. And then we'll think about our water footprint. And just a reminder, going back to what I said, we always see written down planet Earth, but I like to think about planet water, and this visualizes it very, very nicely here. So why is the water cycle so important? Well, it's the fundamental resource. It's necessary to sustain life on Earth. The water cycles linking lands, oceans, the atmosphere in one integrated system. And with that movement, we also get energy exchanges. The National Research Council and NASA have said that water is at the heart of the effects of climate change. So when we get warming, we get melting of ice sheets, we get melting of glaciers, we get increased runoff, we get flooding, and we also get shortages of water in some places. So it's actually very visible there in terms of the effects of climate change. Climate change has also affected water security, and there are lots of concerns around this. So due to warming, changing precipitation patterns, reduction and loss of cryospheric elements. So these are the frozen elements. So reducing the amount of water that's available. So one of the research projects I've been involved in recent years is studying the melting of ice that's in rocks underneath mountains. And we look at valley glaciers very frequently and the shrinking of those, but there's ice that's in high mountain areas, high altitude areas, that's been there since the last ice age, that's now melting. And the normal regular melting in the summer is what provides the water supply to those communities. But if we have consistent melting and then the disappearance of this ice, this is where we begin to see issues around water security. If we also have greater frequency and intensity of climatic extremes, we may get water coming down in very intense events, which is running off the land, causing erosion, but we're not able to retain that effectively to use it through the year. So there's so many issues around water and the changes to the water cycle. Fundamentally, we need to think about it in a systems approach, and we can think about the input to the system through precipitation, the outputs from the system in terms of evaporation from plants, and also the surfaces, and transpiration from plants and trees from all the vegetation. Stores or reservoirs of water we can see in terms of rivers or lakes and the oceans. And then we can also think about transfers or exchanges, so how water moves between some of these different components. So we can see transfers from the atmosphere through precipitation to the land. Here it's falling on a lake, and then it's moving through the layers below into the groundwater. We can see precipitation falling onto the land surface. It drains, infiltrates into the soil, and then flows down into the groundwater, and that might eventually move into the oceans. And from there, it could eventually be evaporated back into the atmosphere. So this is the cycling that we're talking about. And also, you don't need to be concerned about the numbers, but it's important for hydrologists and climatologists to think about exactly how much is moving between these different stores or reservoirs, and what the balance is between them and how that's changing over time. You probably know that large amounts of water are stored in different areas. And if we're thinking about access to water for our own use, we want to know about the fresh water. So 97% of the planet's water is actually is in the oceans. And then we have of this small amount here, this 2.5%, if we then split that up, a large amount here, nearly 70%, is in the cryosphere, the glaciers and our ice caps and other small amounts of ice. So it's not very rapidly accessible, but this is also what's depleting over time with global warming. And then we have about 30% in our groundwater stores. And this is the water that we can access through having deep wells, or we might have aquifers near the surface, and we can take some of that groundwater. And then we have a small amount that's surface water that would be in our rivers and our lakes that's easily accessible to us. But that's a very, very small amount. So a lot of the water, less than 0.3%, is mobile water, and a small percent is fresh water. And we can use different images like this to begin to just sort of show us and really emphasize that very little water on our planet is readily available to us. With changing climate, there are changing hydrological patterns. It's difficult to predict climate change. It's another step to predict the hydrological patterns that occur as a result of changes in mean surface air temperatures, etc. And there are a number of ways we can begin to visualize this in terms of these global maps. And what I want you to do is just try to focus on where the red is showing up, where we're seeing a decline in the amount of precipitation here. So as the world becomes hotter, we see increasing parts of the globe warming up and having less precipitation. We can see in these patterns then soil moisture levels affected as well. So we can see declines in soil moisture levels, and that's also important for agriculture and in terms of our food security. We can see changes in runoff patterns, and some areas are increasing. They're seeing increases in the amount of runoff, and also evaporation. There might be increased losses in some parts of the world, or there may be reductions. So it's a very complex pattern. And the key thing is thinking about, at an individual catchment scale, what is happening within the catchments, and on regional scales and country by country for management. So the important thing is that these hydrological parameters are spatially and temporally variable, and we need very, very detailed models and improvements in the models to be able to plan how much water we have, the surpluses, and be able to manage that in the context of increasing global populations and trying to ensure enough food for everybody. With climate change, it's been noted that the water cycle, so what we looked at in terms of that cycling of precipitation and then evapotranspiration and other transfers, that cycling process is going faster and faster. So the rates of those evaporation and evapotranspiration and precipitation events are increasing. And this is what NASA call the water cycle intensity. So it's intensifying. And there's been some quite interesting research on this, how this water cycle is speeding up. And that makes it even more difficult then to be able to plan how much water we have. So it's important we look at the rates of these processes as well as the amounts that are moving around. The catchment scale is the scale at which we do lots of our planning for water management. And we can see diagrams like this that basically represent the global hydrological cycle at this basin scale. So these are probably diagrams that you've seen before or something similar, where we have precipitation coming into the catchment. It may fall directly on the channel, on a river, and then go into channel storage. It may be intercepted by vegetation, so the precipitation falls on a tree, and then it might run along the stem of the tree, the trunk, and go into surface storage. And from this, it might flow into the channel. It might fall on the vegetation and then move into the soil moisture zone, or it might actually be evaporated. So if precipitation falls on the leaves of the tree, it might be evaporated straight back into the atmosphere. If it goes into the soil moisture zone, it might begin to percolate further into the groundwater zone. And if it goes into the channel, as we've seen with these routes, we can get runoff along the hill slopes and through the catchment. So understanding these processes allows us to better manage our water supplies. We can think about the human impacts operating then at lots of different scales. And as geographers, we're interested in scale. We're interested in looking at things at different spatial scales and over temporal scales. And we can look at how humans have modified, attempted to modify the water cycle at these scales. So the local scale, there have been attempts over many decades to seed clouds, to try to encourage them to produce more precipitation. So this will happen in areas where you have quite arid climates, and you want to try to introduce more condensation nuclei, they're called, tiny particles, which can get the water to coalesce around it and encourage it. They've had mixed effects. At the regional scale, we can see how land cover is impacting climate change. So you might be aware of the huge areas of cultivation in Almeria, where we have glasses, and we have glass houses, and we have polytunnels, and these are affecting the albedo, the reflection of the surface, and you just get a little glimpse of it here in this picture. So if these are all reflecting more back to the atmosphere, that's leading to cooling and affecting the regional climate. We know about burning of fossil fuels and global warming at the global scale, so we can break down some of these effects at different spatial scales. One of the key things that we're interested in the water cycle is flooding, one of the extremes. And we know that flooding is caused by heavy or prolonged rainfall, which is being affected by climate change. So in many parts of the world, in the UK, we're seeing greater intensity in events, precipitation events and flood events. We can also have flooding caused by storm surges, by melting and by dam failures. So in parts of the world where you see seasonal melting, like in the Alps, for example, you might have increased flooding. And there may be failures of dams that have been constructed across river systems. So lots of different causes of flooding. But if we look at the way that it impacts on the system, we can go through a pathway model where we look at the sources of the flooding, what happens to it, where it's going, and then who is impacted at the end of that process. So it might be people, it might be infrastructure, it might be ecosystems. And then we can think in terms of this model, how do we try to react to that to reduce the flood risk? How can we manage floods and build resilience? And one of the key questions that lots of people have asked over many, many years is the flood hazard increasing, and why is it increasing? Well, in the UK, it is increasing, and the former head of the Met Office said, put very, very simply, a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. So as the atmosphere warms, there is more water vapor there, which potentially can be released then as precipitation and result in these high intensity events. So a record-breaking flood event occurred in Cumbria in 2015, in Honister Pass in Cumbria. 341.4 millimeters of rainfall fell in just 24 hours and caused devastating flooding. So we are seeing events which are then becoming new, setting new records. So new UK rainfall record causing this extensive flooding. If we think about the opposite side of this budget, and we think about water scarcity and water insecurity or security, we know that about 1.7 billion people currently live in river basins where the water use is exceeding the recharge. And what I mean by the recharge is either water that's infiltrating back down into that groundwater zone, which is our underground reservoir, or we get river levels falling and soil moisture falling. So the depletion of groundwater supplies and the desiccation of rivers is a major global concern. And we have lots of people where they're living, the water supply is going to run out. So we need to try to reduce our water consumption or think about ways in which we can use it more efficiently. The UN has put water, there's a nice diagram here, water is at the heart of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's the fundamental resource. Without water, we can't live. And clean water, access to clean water and proper sanitation is recognised as a human right, essential for full enjoyment of life and all human rights, all other human rights. So water, understanding the water cycle and being able to manage it sustainably is absolutely critical to human well-being and survival. Hydrologists have produced maps like this, looking at water scarcity. More than 40% of the global population is affected by water stress or lack of water insecurity. And we can look at this diagram here, we can see where we've got an over exploitation of water, and we begin to have experiencing water stress and problems. It's hard to pick out perhaps, but you might be surprised to see the UK, given how wet it was in February this year, you might be surprised to see red and these amber colours in the UK. And that's because we have a rising population and we're also consuming water much more. So we need to think about how we can, even in a humid, temperate climate, use our water carefully. And we can look at other diagrams like this. This is from the World Resources Institute, which does projections about future water use and the ratio of withdrawals of water from sources like our groundwater, our underground aquifer systems, and what stresses we're likely to see. So we can see that the predictions are around global demand for water to rise by 20 to 30% in 2050. And that will mean that large parts of the world, we will have these very high ratios of withdrawals to supply. So here we've got 80%, and you can see here then that that's going to be a critical situation for these countries. And the possibility of running out of water stresses, it's severe water stresses. So it's a rather scary picture, and that's why lots of hydrologists and others talk about the climate emergency and climate crisis. But there are things we can do, and that's why we need to start acting now with reductions in greenhouse gases and trying to think about how we can conserve our water and use it more efficiently. An interesting concept was developed by Tony Allen, a professor at King's College some years ago now. And we've talked about the water cycle, and I've introduced it in terms of precipitation, evapotranspiration, flow through rivers into lakes, infiltration into the groundwater system. But Tony Allen started to think about water that's in lots of the things we consume. So the water that's in our food, in fruit and vegetables, the water that is required to grow those crops, and then the water that is required to create the clothes that we wear, you know, our cotton t-shirts and our jeans, etc. So this is the concept of virtual water. And it actually demonstrated that the majority of water that's consumed globally is used within the production and consumption of goods and services, especially food. Some people call it embedded water, and this concept was developed while researching certain countries which were able to meet food security despite their water scarce economies. And he looked at how water was moving around the globe in terms of these different goods and services. So we can think about our water footprint. We're probably more familiar with carbon footprints, you know, thinking about booking a flight or something and being concerned about how much that carbon footprint will be. But we can think about our water footprint, and it's just as important alongside our carbon footprint. So there are diagrams like this that illustrate how much water it takes to produce different items. So we have, for example, here, you know, we've got the bottled water. So 1 litre of bottled water takes 5 litres of water to produce it. but 1 litre of tap water is just 1 litre of water to produce. So we should try to use tap water where possible. We look at tea and coffee. Coffee takes much more water in the growing of the coffee beans, etc., to make a cup of coffee. And then we move through the scale and we move from vegetables through to meat consumption here at the far end of the table. So what you eat and what you buy and what you use all go to make your water footprint. So it's just worth bearing that in mind, and it's worth countries who are planning, you know, what kind of agriculture we should move to, and you know, what changes might be put in place in terms of the types of crops we grow. So those are interesting concepts. And in terms of the movement around the world, we can begin to look at how many countries are exporting and importing water in a virtual form. Okay, so that's a kind of glimpse into the water cycle and some of the big issues, I think, around water and how the water cycle is changing in relation to climate change. I'd now like to move to considering the carbon cycle. And understanding the carbon cycle is really our first step to trying to understand and then hopefully better manage and mitigate the impacts of the human-induced rise in greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide is one of our main greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide and ozone the others. Methane is actually a more what we call potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but we're going to focus on the big carbon cycle because that's a really fundamental cycle. But we shouldn't forget the other greenhouse gases when we're talking about climate change. So the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon from one form to another. So in a way, it's similar to some of those diagrams we've looked at for water. We can see the different areas where carbon occurs. And it's important that we think about the main stores or reservoirs of carbon when we're thinking about it globally. So carbon can be stored in our soils and our rocks. It can be stored in the oceans. It's stored in terrestrial areas in our plants and vegetation, and then also stored in the atmosphere. So these are the main carbon stores. Scientists have been working to look at global carbon cycles and the carbon dioxide growth rate to look at the changes in carbon in these different zones and what the fluxes are between them. This is quite a detailed diagram, so I don't want you to get concerned about all the different numbers that are on here. But I want to just focus on one part of the diagram, and we can see here that what is shown in the black font here is the values that we're getting that occurred prior to the industrial revolution, industrial era, or the estimated values. And then we can see in red the additional fluxes that have occurred as a result of human change, what we call the anthropogenic fluxes. And this diagram was a nice one produced by IPCC a decade ago now, but it's a nice illustration of some key changes. So averaged over 2000 to 2009, what we're seeing is a large increase here in the atmospheric carbon, and it's all coming from fossil fuels and land use change. So burning of fossil fuels here, and also land use changes. So things like deforestation primarily, and some burning of the land. So these are our two main contributors to the atmospheric increase in carbon. And I also put this diagram up here because in the literature, if you're reading about the carbon cycle, scientists present carbon values and fluxes in these units that you may not be fully familiar with, and you may have wondered what they actually mean. So in this diagram here, we've just got an average flux, so it's per year, and the value here is 4, so it's 4 petagrams of carbon per year. And 1 petagram is also equal to 1 gigaton, and it's equal to 1 billion tons of carbon. So these are quite difficult units, and it's very difficult, I think, to imagine what that means. So we can say, oh, 4 petagrams of carbon. So it's 4 billion tons of carbon. And I like to imagine things in terms of things that I can visualize that are sort of more tangible. And if we just look at that then, so we've got 1 gigaton, which is 1 billion metric tons. And we have 1 gigaton then is equal to 6 million blue whales or 100 million elephants. So diagrams like this are quite useful, I think, in trying to visualize how much carbon is going into the atmosphere. So it's large amounts of carbon that are entering the atmosphere every year, and still increasing. Where is this coming from? Well, we had a little preview in the previous diagram that was showing all the fluxes. This is zoning in a little further and simplifying it, but just to focus on where this carbon's coming from, or the greenhouse gases. So predominantly, we saw on that diagram when we had the numbers there, it's coming from fossil fuel emissions, from biomass burning and fires, and deforestation. But we also get some disturbance of the soil with agricultural activities, which can release carbon. And you may also have volcanoes erupting. You may have, and one of my colleagues here, Lisa Bellier, she works on peatlands in northern areas, so the north of Canada, for example. And we know that peat stores large amounts of carbon. And when peat begins to melt in these permafrost areas, that's releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. So we've got these main sources here of carbon. And if we look at the accumulated carbon over time, we can begin to look at these two changes, fossil fuels and land use, increasing over time to give us our total cumulative emissions of carbon. Okay, so thinking about that, we've picked up on deforestation as a critical thing in terms of the increase in atmospheric carbon. So 1/3 of the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the industrial era has come from deforestation. So deforestation is obviously a critical activity, and it's something that COP26 and future COPs will continue to focus on in terms of getting agreements, and we'll come back to that a bit later. So if deforestation is really important, what do forests do? Let's understand a little bit more about what they do in terms of the carbon cycle. And I like this picture because it shows how forests are the lungs of our planet. Through the process of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is taken into plants, into our trees, and it is through the process of photosynthesis then converted into food for the vegetation, and it releases oxygen, which is good for us and good for the planet. So trees will sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it. So they are carbon stores. As trees and vegetation grow, they store the carbon, which makes up about half of their total biomass. So they have a critical role in climate change. And through deforestation, we're stopping this process. So we're losing a major carbon store. And it's been shown through research that trees continue to store carbon throughout the whole of their lives. Early thoughts were that most carbon was sequestered in the kind of early growth years of trees when they were growing rapidly. But in fact, mature trees continue to sequester carbon. So let's just have a look at the photosynthesis equation, which I've just put in words here as well. So primary production means the generation of biological material by plants via photosynthesis. So it's how carbon flows from the atmosphere to the terrestrial biosphere, to that store, that carbon store. So we basically have CO2 plus water plus light, which is what we know trees and other plants need. And then that is converted into carbohydrates or food for the plants, plus oxygen and water. So that's what's transpired from the plants, the water vapor. So it's limited by light, nutrients, water, and temperature. So if we look at net primary productivity around the world, we think about where carbon is removed most from the atmosphere by plants. So which areas have the highest net primary productivity? So they are in the forested areas, and our tropical forests are the areas where we have the highest rates of removal, and they are the biggest sinks of carbon. So we can see areas like this, our tropical and our subtropical forests, store the most carbon, followed by our northern forests. Okay, but this is the critical thing here to think about, these tropical forests that have the ability to store most carbon. They're dominated by broad-leaved evergreen species that have higher biodiversity and very high productivity. And the reason they can store so much carbon is because they're photosynthesizing all year round. There's consistent light, there's consistently warm temperatures, and no limitation of precipitation. So trees are important. And what we need to think about then is how we can prevent deforestation and try to look at some of the critical issues. So we need to try to act to prevent deforestation that's occurring in our tropical rainforests, where we often get removal, felling of trees and then burning. And this can result in what we call tipping points, where it's difficult to go back and replant trees, so the land will become degraded. So we might have tipping points. And you may remember in 2019, some very extensive forest fires in South America, and global images like this being shown on a daily basis with a number of wildfires. So startling effects, so wildfires, but also deforestation for agricultural use, so dramatic losses of vegetation. So if we know that trees are really good as carbon stores, tropical forests offer 30% or up to 30% of potential climate mitigation. So we could offset our fossil fuel generation and try to keep within that 1.5 degrees C warming if we were to have more trees. So what we need to try to do is to work to stopping or reducing deforestation and then planting more trees. And this would come under the umbrella of an approach called nature-based solutions for climate change, trying to look at things we can do in terms of understanding the carbon cycle and trying to reduce the effects of climate change. So we have quotes like this: tree planting has mind-blowing potential to tackle the climate crisis. And it was a big focus actually of COP26. Forests could provide about 1/3 of total carbon dioxide reductions required to keep global warming below 2 degrees C through to 2030. And if we combine that with other measures, we may just have the hope of keeping within the 1.5 degrees C increase in atmospheric temperature. So the obvious question to ask then is how many trees we should plant. And research shows that there is the potential land surface and areas where we could plant 1 trillion trees to capture the carbon dioxide. So this was from an article published in Science. And another paper calculated that there are currently about 3 trillion trees in the world, which is about half the number that existed before the rise of human civilization. So it seems to corroborate that a goal of 3 trillion trees would be a good one to aim for. But there is still a net loss on a yearly basis of 10 billion trees. So the critical thing is to focus on trying to conserve the trees that we have, especially our mature trees, to allow them to grow. They're continuously sequestering carbon and storing it, and at the same time be starting a planting process of these trillion trees. So it's about both sides of that management activity. And we know that deforestation, we see images like this, where tree cover is still being lost at an alarming rate in our tropical rainforest areas. Here we see focused in on South America and the Amazonian rainforest. And this is areas with more than 30% loss in tree cover since 2001. So there have been positive moves at COP26, and we hope that will continue with the next COP. World leaders committed to halt and reverse forest loss by 2030. Be nice to see it happening faster, but it's a good commitment. 91% of global forests are covered by this agreement, and Brazil has become a signatory of that COP agreement. So there are positives, and we just hope that that is actually put into practice. So returning to some of these climate changes that we began with at the beginning of this talk, how to limit warming. Well, at the moment, we're not on track to keep within the 1.5. We're probably moving more towards the 2 degrees C, which will still have lots more impacts, but we could achieve the 1.5 if we put into operation lots of different measures. But it needs global action. So urgent actions are required to reduce emissions and increase carbon capture and storage. And you may have thought about some of these in your A-level classes. We've looked at nature-based solutions because I was talking about the carbon cycle, but there are technical solutions related to carbon capture as well. So something that's been in the news quite recently is this idea of direct air capture. We need to phase out the use of fossil fuels, change the sort of energy, our energy dependency on those, moving to solar and wind and ground heat source, etc. We also need to think about sustainable production and consumption of food, because we need to think about not forgetting the water cycle. If we think about the water cycle as well, that needs to be part of our climate change planning. We need to think about deforestation, halting it, not just slowing it. And we need to think about mitigating or reducing land degradation, which can release CO2. And we need to plant those 1 trillion trees or more if we have the space and the ability. And one of the things you might like to do after this talk is think about some of the other things we could do. You may have come across this publication that was in 2020. It was the government's plan for a green industrial revolution. So supporting green jobs and accelerating our path to net zero. And this was part of a commitment to achieve net zero by 2050. So the idea is around limiting human-caused global warming, and that requires us to have these in place, pathways that are consistent with the 1.5 and 2 degrees C carbon budgets. And the IPCC report has said that to be able to do that implies rapid, deep, and immediate greenhouse gas emission reductions in all sectors. So that's in the most recent IPCC report that was published on the 20th of March. So we need rapid and we need immediate reductions. And just 10 days later, I thought it might be interesting to just see these new publications that have come out from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So they're companion publications, policy documents about powering up Britain. One is they're supposed to work together. So one is focused on how do we provide energy security in the context of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the other side is how do we achieve net zero? What is our plan to get there? So the plan claims that the UK, the idea is that we continue to extract fossil fuels without undermining net zero commitments by investing more in carbon capture. But there's quite a lot of debate around this already from a number of scientists that the technology is perhaps not proven, and maybe it's not at a scale that would actually allow us to meet those urgent and immediate reductions that the IPCC are calling for. So I'll leave that for you to think about. You can download these documents on the website and have a look through yourself. And there's quite a nice podcast actually on this, which was on the evening of the publication of the reports. And it's on BBC Sounds, the 30th of March, and it's called Slipping Through the Net Zero. So you might want to, if you're particularly interested in this, have a look at some of those debates. Whatever we do and whatever approach we need or whatever pathway we take, all of them will need mitigation. So mitigation in terms of halting deforestation. We will need to adapt. We'll need to adapt in terms of perhaps the type of foods that we eat. We might need to adapt in terms of the type of energy supplies we're prepared to rely on. There will need to be finance for these. We will need financing for green technology. We also need global finance, you know, the funds that the COP26 have signed up to in terms of supporting parts of the world that didn't produce the fossil fuels, that are now experiencing disproportionate effects from things like rising sea levels. So we need those funds. And we also need to collaborate. We need to collaborate on local scales and within countries. We need to collaborate regionally, and we need global collaboration. So it's a very difficult challenge, but I hope the insights that you have gained through your A-level in the water and carbon cycle, and maybe some slightly new concepts that I've introduced you to today, shows that we can actually make positive changes. And we do, I think, have the potential, if we start to act now, to meet those rises, to keep within the 1.5 degrees C of warming. A concept that was quite popular some time ago, I just want to return to, because you might feel under the weight of all this that it's actually such an overwhelming situation. What can I do as an individual? So I think the think local, act local is quite a nice way to do this. And I just wanted to end with a quote here from Sir David Attenborough. You may have been watching the series Wild Isles, and I'd encourage you to have a look at the freshwater episode, which was shown yesterday evening. So these are some actions that you might take to reduce water and carbon footprints. So without preaching, David Attenborough just leaves us with these thoughts about: don't be too extravagant, don't waste, do what you can to cut unnecessary expenditure, don't eat more than you need, don't travel more than you need, be responsible, careful citizens of this planet, which is our only home, and for the creatures that live in it. So I think there's just positive messages on all levels, but hopefully you've seen that some of the scientific underpinning and the underpinning that comes from being a geographer is important, because it's geographers who think at these multiple scales, both spatial scales and temporal scales. And we understand that interaction between the physical, biological worlds and the human components as well. So it's the one subject really that brings it all together. So hopefully that's been useful for some of your continuing A-level work. Hopefully it's prompted a few questions and things that you haven't thought about before. So thank you very much for listening. And I think Seda might be taking some questions in the chat. If there are any questions, I'm really happy to to answer those, or try to answer them at least.
Thank you so much, Geraldine, for your talk. Yeah, we can take some questions now for Geraldine about her talk, or maybe about some of our programs. Well, we'll give you maybe some time to think. Fija, do you want to quickly introduce yourselves while our students think of some questions for Geraldine?
Right. Hi guys. My name is Fija. I am can you guys see me? Because I can't see myself. Okay, that's good. My name is Fija. I'm a second year human geography student. Yeah, I'll be answering any questions you have, course related or house uni life specifically. Yeah, I did for my A-levels, I did A-level psychology, A-level geography, and A-level politics, and I did an AS EPQ. So any questions?
Maybe we'll give another minute or so for students. Well, we've got one question
How
in the
is
chat.
uni life? Yeah, I can see. Completely different from A-level. I feel like for me personally, A-level was the most stressful 2 years of my life because everything was so condensed. There was exams, and I did go through the pandemic. So that was quite hard as well for me, because the way my sixth form, they chose to do a lot of exams so they could give us a suitable grade for what we did, because we couldn't do the actual real exams. So uni life is more independent. I think one big thing that's different from A-levels and secondary school is that during secondary and A-level, you tend to be guided. I'm not saying the university doesn't guide you, it's just deadlines, the way you do your stuff is all up to you. There's professors that would help you throughout the year, but you schedule your own timetable, you schedule your own structure. That's one of the big difference. Other than that, being a Queen Mary student, I do feel like I have a lot of work-life balance. So on the side, I do a few part-time jobs. And it doesn't really interfere with my studies because I can see that my grade hasn't changed, or I don't feel too stressed. So that's one good thing. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Fija. Any other questions? Fija, maybe you can give an overview of how your week is as a university student. So maybe how many lectures you have, how many seminars, etc.
What do you mean by, is it scary? Like in what context? So my uni, so I'm currently second year semester B. So the way it's laid out, you do 4 modules on each semester. Well, yeah, 4 modules on each semester, and one of the modules is a 30 credit module. Usually you go through that throughout the whole year. Because I'm doing geography, for me, that is like my main sort of research method. So the way it works is that you have your lecture, you go in that big group, usually it's in a big room, you attend that. Then you do your pre-reading, your work. It depends on your lecturer. They either ask you to do pre-reading beforehand the lecture, or sometimes there are modules where they ask you to do after in your own time, independent studies. And then you tend to have, for most modules so far, there's a tutorial or seminar group, is where you come into much more smaller group and you discuss those issues, or if you have any questions that you didn't understand directly with your professor. Is uni life scary as you get older and no longer like? It's not scary. I feel like it's a good life skills. You tend to develop a lot of, I think university, the way it is, it prepares you for your work. Yeah, for your work life, that, because you develop your sort of own skills. So for example, I never used to be this confident. I never used to do these sort of talks or anything like that. And I feel like uni really did help me, because independent is a big thing. Even when I've been doing like a few internships or doing work, sometimes you need to take your decision by yourself. And that's what uni does essentially. Like, to be honest, I have a choice. I don't really, but I do at the same time. I can attend the lecture or I can't. But then it's also that question for, so how responsible I am. Like you can clearly, I think one thing teachers can clearly see if you're attending lectures or not doing like for your exams, because a lot of people wing it. Yes, I understand it, but then you can also see the bright ones, and then you can see those who put the bare minimum effort. And you still have guidance, you know, they will always prompt you if you have any sort of questions. So what Queen Mary has is an advice and feedback hours. So each of your modules professors that would have this 2 hours per week dedicated for students to come in, any questions one-to-one rather than in a group, because sometimes you might not feel comfortable enough to share as a group. Hope that answered. I think there was another one.
Maybe we'll just wait for more questions to come through, but I've got a question for you, Fija. Can you tell us how you chose the degree program you're studying now? And is there any advice you'd give to our students today in terms of choosing a degree for them?
Okay, so my story is that I chose geography kind of last minute. I always like geography, but then my initial first choice was psychology. I had a whole personal statement and everything written down, but then last minute something in me said psychology is not for me, and I just chose geography. My biggest advice would be, because it's a 3-year or 4-year dedicated program, do something that you really find interest. And I'm not saying throughout the whole program or throughout the whole 3 years you would like everything, because there are certain things, certain modules that I don't like, but then choosing a way you can go through it. That's a good thing about degree, is that it gives you an opportunity to do what you like. And I know sometimes it's scary because I'm very indecisive as well, but then if you feel like that's for you and you can go through that, that's a good thing. Another thing I did is that whatever uni you applied, go through the teaching criteria and what module they have, and see if, if that's, what, I think I like that, I can do that, or maybe I don't like that, but I can still do that. It helps, like you can answer yourself questions to that. One thing I did, and the reason why Queen Mary stood out to me, because I did apply to King's, but I just didn't like that module as much as I liked Queen Mary's one. I feel like I would have just went through because I had to, not because I enjoyed. So do something that you really enjoy. There's another question: what aspect of geography do you find the most interesting? So my program is BA Human Geography. I don't do physical at all, so I wouldn't learn about carbon cycles or rivers. It's just my own preference. I like to learn more about the people aspect, so the way that we live, the cultural, the economic, and like within my program, I didn't expect it, but there's so much that I've been learning I learned from economic geographies to cultural geographies. And one of my favorite module is GIS, which is, I know it sounds a bit boring, but it's quite interesting. It's where you make maps and you see like how much work goes into map. It's not just a piece of map that guides you to it. And then you get to like use their softwares where you make your own map. So I've been doing that for 2 years. It's really good. But yeah, I think there's more. What is your favorite thing about university? I think having more freedom. Because again, you're managing your own schedule. So after uni, like one thing I really like to do is hang out with my friend, chill for a little bit. We tend to have a lot of little session and day, or even sometimes just go out, have fun. What else? I like the way the course is structured, because the way it's prepared, the way it's like laid out is that it gives you enough time to do your assignments and it's not too heavy. So for example, Mondays are usually where I have all my lectures, and then on Thursdays and Fridays I have my seminars, so I get Tuesday to Wednesday off, free, and I can do whatever I want on those days. So it's quite nice. What else? what kind of support do you get as a uni student? So we have a lot of support. We have the career support, which I've started to use recently. I wish I used in first year, but then I've only got I only started because I'm now thinking, okay, what do I want to do with my degree and etc. So I started to use that, and it really guides you to the pages and to the link that you need. So for example, I want to get into something related to civil servants, specifically within the environmental sector. And I was like, because it's such a broad department and you've got so many departments within that, I was really overwhelmed. When I opened my iPad, I typed in and I was like, I can't do that. So I went to the careers and support, booked an appointment, got an appointment, went in, and it was really nice because it was like showing, it started off saying who you are as a person, what you want to do, and then we just narrowed down to the jobs that I could get in and to the internship that I could apply, to the opportunities that I could apply. So in terms of career-wise, there's a whole career network. There's also in the geography square building, the mental health support. So even if you ever feel stressed, I haven't used it personally, but I know a few people that have used them. They found that quite helpful. What else? There's also, you get, so in the School of Geography, you tend to have a tutor, sort of form tutor, but not really, where you would meet every 3 to 4 weeks to discuss how are you finding uni, etc., etc. It just helps you. I feel like, for example, with me, with that professor, I do have a quite close. I feel confident. I feel like if I have any question, I could go on ask, because then they could guide me to the right path. So there's a lot of guidance. As I said, I know I emphasize being independent, but at the same time, if you need help and support, is always around you. I think there's more that popped up. How's uni life? Okay, and I just saw a lot of questions come up, but I don't know.
I can see one for you, Jo. It says, someone's asked, what extracurricular activities are there?
So there's societies. I have joined quite a few societies, and the best year to join society is year 1 and year 2, because your workload is not as heavy, because once you get through dissertation, that's where your stress comes in. So I'm part of a book club society, where we meet every 2 weeks and we come together. I'm part of the knitting society and the crocheting, because that's what I like. There's also cultural societies, so like depending on what background you are, there's loads of that. I also joined the ISOC Society, which is an Islamic faith society. We come together, discuss. We have loads of events. There's way more societies. A lot more societies. There's gaming societies. I know there's anime societies. I think there's all sorts of societies that welcomes everyone and anyone. How different is geography at university to sixth form? Really different, in a good way. I found sixth form geography really hard because there was so many, as I said, so much to do. I couldn't hack it. And that's one of the reasons I was like, maybe I should do psychology, but then I chose geography. Uni geography, as I said, if you go, whatever uni apply, and go to their website and you look at their sort of what modules they do, it tailors towards your liking, depending what uni you pick. So, for example, semester A, all of my modules were fine because you get more control in year 2 and year 3 on what modules you pick. So there's a list of modules that you can pick. You don't have to, it's not set. I think only for year 1 is set because they want you to like do the basic. So yeah. And that we also have trips going around. I know a lot of my friends went to the Belfast trip. It's a residential trip. You go in for 4 days, away for 4 days. And next week they're going to New York. Physical geography has a lot more trip, I think, because all of my friends are like trip. But then within cultural and other modules, you have trips within your area.
Amazing. Thank you, Fija. I don't think we have any more questions in the chat box. Maybe we'll give it another minute. But I just had a question for Geraldine. Geraldine, what advice would you give to our students? Most of these students will be year 12, year 13. Some may have decided what they do want to study. Some may be clueless. So what advice would you give them?
Well, I think the key thing is something that Fija said. Think about what you really enjoy, what you're excited to read about and study and investigate yourself. And then that will be the passion that gets you through, you know, and the motivation. So you want to come to university reading a subject that you just love and that you're interested in. So that's a key thing. And then I think within geography, if you're choosing geography, then I think it's, you know, there are lots of different modules on offer, and there'll be things that you've never come across before. And I think don't be scared to try something new. You know, in your first year of Queen Mary, BA and BSc students come together and study a number of modules jointly. So you have a wide foundation in the subject. And then you might find that you have a real interest in something like GIS. You won't have studied that before. You might find that you're really interested in some more of the, for instance, environmental change work and dating methods and paleo work, or you might be really interested in you know, areas like mine, but from a more practical point of view. So you will do the basics in river science and hydrology, but then go on to do more management applications, you know, restoration of freshwater systems and things. So I think just be open to trying new things as well. So yeah, but always go with what you enjoy, because when you're choosing things and when you're choosing, and it's the same thing, Fija mentioned the dissertation, which is a piece of research, individual research with support from a supervisor, but it's a chance to really focus on a topic. And that's what I always say to students choosing their dissertation topics. Pick something that you're really fascinated in, because with any research there are periods where it's just quite a hard slog, and if you're interested in that subject, it gets you through those moments, and then you'll have your inspired moments and your achievements. So it's all about identifying you as a person and what you want to do, and then maybe you'll continue to use geography in your career. And I know, you know, I work closely with Susan Smith, our careers and enterprise person for geography, and she always takes the time to speak to students and find out about them and what drives them, what interests them. And again, it's about that enjoyment, and that's what you want to try and match onto a future career path as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Geraldine. I think that's all we have time for. I will pop in our email address in the chat box. If you do have any questions afterwards, you can submit them later on. Thank you again, Geraldine and Fija, for today. I'll also pop in an evaluation form in the chat box. If you could just kindly fill it in just to tell us how you found today's session, that would be great. We have a couple more taster talks coming up, so do keep an eye out on our webpage for those. But thank you all so much for joining, and have a good evening.